Good day, everyone. I am Mara Vanessa Jordan, the third and last reporter of Group 7 as a continuation of Ms. Palar's report. My topics are synthesizing images and propositions and spatial cognition and cognitive maps. This is the topic outline. The first topic is synthesizing images and propositions with subtopics. Do experimenters' expectations influence experiment outcomes? Johnson Laird's mental models, neuroscience evidence for multiple codes, left brain or right brain, where is information manipulated, and the two kinds of images, visual versus spatial. The next topic is spatial cognition and cognitive maps with subtopics of rats, bees, pigeons, and humans, rules of thumb for using our mental maps heuristics, and creating maps from what you hear, text maps. The intended learning outcomes are first, to describe mental representations proposed by Johnson Laird. Second, to explain the mental model. And lastly, to be able to discuss cognitive maps. Synthesizing images and propositions. There are two opposing views of knowledge representation. One is dual code theory, suggesting that knowledge is represented both in images and in symbols. And the second is a propositional theory, suggesting that knowledge is represented only in underlying propositions, not in the form of images, words, or other symbols. Mental imagery appears functionally equivalent to perception in many ways. This conclusion is based on studies of mental rotations, image scaling, and image scanning. However, the studies involving ambiguous figures and unfamiliar mental manipulations suggest that there are limits to the analogy between perception and imagery. Do experimenters' expectations influence experiment outcomes? So, some of the confirmatory results found in image research could be the result of demand characteristics, that is, subjects' perception of what is expected of them when they participate in an experiment. Intans Peterson set out to investigate this question. Do experimenters' expectancies regarding the performance of participants on a particular task create an implicit demand for the participants to perform as expected? Intans Peterson required her subjects to do two versions of each task, one which called for the use of mental imagery and another where the relevant stimuli were actually perceptually present. So she manipulated experimenter expectancies by suggesting to one group of experiments that task performance would be expected to be better for perceptual tasks than imaginal ones. She suggested the opposite outcomes to the second group of experimenters. However, she did not run the experimental subjects herself. Instead, she used a number of assistant experimenters to instruct the subjects in their tasks and to collect the results. And half of these assistants were led to believe that their subjects would perform better or more quickly or more accurately in the perceptual condition of the agreements, and the other were led to believe that their subjects would perform better in the imagery condition. She found the experimenter expectancies did influence participants' responses in three tasks: image scanning, mental rotations, and another task comparing perceptual performance with imaginal performance. So the debate between the propositional hypothesis and the functional equivalence or analogical hypothesis has been suggested to be intractable based on existing knowledge. For each empirical finding that supports the view that imagery is analogous to perception, a rationalist reinterpretation of the finding may be offered. The reinterpretation of the alternative explanation of the finding, although a rationalist alternative may be less parsimonious explanation than the empiricist explanation, the alternative cannot be refuted outright. Therefore, the debate between the functional equivalence view and the propositional view may boil down to a debate between empiricism and rationalism. So in light of Ronald Fink's principles on visual imagery, here are the study findings for the possible questions generated from those principles. On the first principle, the finding is that mental rotations generally conform to the same laws of motion and space that are observed in physical perceptions. even showing performance decrements associated with degraded stimuli. However, it appears that for some mental images, mental rotation of imaginal objects do not fully and accurately represent the physical rotation of perceived objects. Therefore, some non-imaginal knowledge representation or cognitive strategies appear influential in some situations. In image scanning, it takes longer to scan across a large distance in a mental image than across a smaller distance. Then the findings for the second principle is that it appears that cognitive manipulation of mental images are analogous to manipulations of percepts in studies involving image size. As in visual perception, there are limits to the resolution of the featural details of an image, as well as limits to the size of the image space that can be observed at any one time. To observe greater detail of an individual objects, a smaller size or number of objects or parts of objects may be observed and vice versa. So in related work, it appears easier to see the detail of larger mental images than of smaller ones. It appears also that just as we perceive the physical proximity of objects that are closer together in physical space, we also imagine the closeness of mental images in our mental image space. For the third principle, after participants have been asked to form a mental image, they can answer some questions that require them to infer information based on the image which was not specifically encoded at the time they created the image. The studies by Reed and by Chambers and Risberg suggest that propositional representations may play a role. Studies by Fink and by Petersons and colleagues suggest that imaginal representations are sometimes sufficient for drawing inferences. So for the fourth principle, studies of lifelong blind people suggest that mental imagery in the form of spatial arrangements may be constructed from haptic rather than visual information. So based on the findings regarding cognitive maps, it appears that both propositional and imaginal knowledge representations influence the construction of spatial arrangements. And lastly, the result for the fifth principle is that it appears that some of the same regions of the brain that are involved in manipulating visual percepts may be involved in manipulating mental imagery. But it also appears that spatial and visual imagery may be represented differently in the brain. So those are the findings or results of the questions generated from the proposed principle of Ronald Fink. Now, Johnson-Laird's mental model. An alternative synthesis of the literature suggests that mental representations may take any of the three forms: propositions, images, or mental models. The three types of mental representations, the first is propositional representations, are pieces of information resembling natural language. In layman's term, the relationships between objects are represented by symbols and not by spatial mental images of the scene. Number two, mental imagery are perceptual models from a particular point of view. To put it simply, representations and the accompanying experience of sensory information without a direct external stimulus. Such representations are recalled from memory and lead one to re-experience a version of the original stimulus or some novel combination of stimuli. Number three, mental models are structural analogies of the world. In short, this is the personal internal representation of external reality that people use to interact with the world around them. In sum, mental models provide an additional means of representation in addition to propositions and visual images. They are not mutually exclusive with these other two forms of representation, but they are complementary to them. And mental models provide a way of explaining empirical findings such as haptic and auditory forms of imagery, which seem quite different from visual imagery. Now, the cat is under the table. It may be represented in several ways: as a proposition because it is verbally expressed, and as an image because a particular cat in a particular position under a particular table, or as a mental model as you can visualize any cat or table. Thus, mental models provide a way of explaining empirical findings such as haptic and auditory forms of imagery, which seem quite different from visual imagery. Now, neuropsychological evidence for multiple codes. Participants involved in a research project involving cognitive tasks can be influenced by the expectations of the researchers, but it seems implausible that such factors would equally influence the result of neuropsychological research. However, brain damage patients do not know that particular lesions are supposed to lead to particular kinds of deficits. Indeed, the patient rarely know where a lesion is until after deficits are discovered. Thus, neuropsychological findings may circumvent many issues of demand characteristics in resolving the dual code controversy. However, this research does not eliminate experimental biases regarding where to look for lesions or the deficits arising from them. That's why neuropsychology proposes to address the problem of bias in experience based on the principle that a subject can alter his behavior but cannot alter the functioning of his brain as an organ. Sa madaling salita, I will give you an example. Suppose you remembered every word in chapter 2 regarding which particular parts of our brain govern which kinds of perceptual and cognitive functions. Alam mo yung specific functions nila, forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. Then, kinuha kang participant ng neuropsychological research. And as a participant, you will be conforming to the experimenter's expectations. You would have to control directly your brain's activities and functions so that you would simulate what experimenters expected in association with particular perceptual or cognitive function. So, ito, ibig sabihin ng subject can alter his behavior. And yung phrase na cannot alter the functioning of his brain as an organ is hindi natin mababago ang function ng brain as an organ, which is to control the thought, memory, emotions, touch, motor skills, vision, breathing, temperature, hunger, every process that regulates the brain and the body. Na i-change it to other function, which is to pump blood. Sorry. Now, the left brain or right brain, where is information manipulated? Neuropsychological research on imagery came from studies of patients with identified lesions and from split brain patients. Now, researchers found that the right hemisphere appears to represent and manipulate visuospatial knowledge in a manner similar to perception. The right hemisphere of the human brain represents knowledge in a manner that is analogous to our physical environment. This is also the case with the brains of other animals. In contrast, the left hemisphere appears to be more proficient in representing and manipulating verbal and other symbol-based knowledge. Unlike the brains of other animals, however, the left hemisphere only of the human brain has the ability to manipulate imaginal components and symbols and to generate entirely new information. So, some researchers look to deformed brains, those with injuries or lesions in specific locations, to suggest the functioning of the mind. It is assumed that the damage is the cause of cognitive anomalies and the subject has neither knowledge nor control of the anomalies that should result from a particular kind of damage. In specific, it is noted that lesions in certain areas of the brain seem to affect symbol manipulation functions such as language, where others influence information storage and retrieval. Such as is necessary to recognize faces from such studies. We have evidence that the right hemisphere is associated with the visual memory and perception, whereas the left is associated with the verbal memory and comprehension. It is also suggested that the left side has the ability to manipulate imagined concepts and symbols and to generate entirely new information, whereas the right is limited to representing knowledge in a manner that is consistent with the physical environment. Specifically, it is believed to be distinctly human and distinctly left brain characteristic to conceive what has never been perceived. So, the two kinds of image, visuous versus spatial. While examining visual imagery, researchers have found that images actually may be stored in different formats in the mind depending on what kind of image is involved. Visual imagery refers to the use of images that represent visual characteristics such as colors and shapes. Spatial imagery refers to the images that represent spatial features such as depth, dimensions, distances, and orientations. The difference being that visual imagery corresponds to the qualities of a perceived item, such as its color and shape, and it is processed in the occipital lobe, whereas the spatial imagery corresponds to its relation to other things such as the size, position, and the distance, as well as the qualities pertaining to its position relative to a light source, such as the shadow and textures. Now, neuropsychological evidence suggests that our cognitive architecture includes representations of both the visual appearance of objects in terms of their form, color, and perspectives, and of the spatial structure of the objects in terms of the three-dimensional layout in space. Now, knowledge of object labels, recognizing the object by name and attributes, answering questions about the characteristics of the objects, taps propositional symbolic knowledge about the picture's objects. In contrast, the ability to manipulate the orientation, such as the rotation or the size of the image. It taps imaginable analogous knowledge of the objects, thus both forms the representation seems to answer particular kinds of questions for knowledge use. Spatial condition and cognitive maps. Most of the studies described thus far have involved the way in which we represent pictorial knowledge. The studies are based in what we have perceived by looking and then imagining visual stimuli. Other research suggests that we may form imaginal maps based solely in our physical cycle interactions with and navigation through our physical environment. This is true even when we never have a chance to see the whole world picture as far as from an aerial photograph or a map. Spatial cognition deals with the acquisition, organization, and the use of knowledge about objects and actions in 2 and 3-dimensional space, while cognitive maps are internal representation of our physical environment, particularly centering on spatial relationships. Now, cognitive maps seems to offer internal representations that simulate particular spatial features of our external environment. Of rats, bees, pigeons, and humans, some of the earliest work of the cognitive maps was done by Edward Tolman during the 1930s. In one study, the researchers were interested in the ability of rats to learn a maze. The rats were divided into 3 groups. The first group, the rats had to learn the maze. Their reward for getting from the start box to the end box was food. Eventually, these rats learned to run the maze without making any errors. In other words, they did not make wrong turns or follow blind alleys. The second group of rats also was placed in the maze, but these rats received no reinforcement for successfully getting to the end box. Although their performance improved over time, they continued to make more errors than the reinforced group. These results are hardly surprising. We would expect the reward group to have more incentive to learn. Now, the third group of rats received no rewards for 10 days of learning trials, and on the 11th day, however, the food was placed in the end of the box for the first time. With just one reinforcement, the learning of these rats improved dramatically. Now, these rats ran the maze about as well in fewer trials as the rats in the first group. Because they have already mental map, they learned latently, so they find easily. Now, according to Tolman, the rats were learning a cognitive map, an internal representation of the maze. Decades later, even very simple creatures were to appear able to form some cognitive maps. These creatures may be able to translate imaginary representation into primitive, pre-wired, analogical, and perhaps even symbolic form. Now, a Nobel Prize-winning German scientist studied the behavior of bees when they return to their hive after having located a source of nectar. Apparently, bees not only can form imaginal maps for getting food sources, they also can use a somewhat symbolic form for communicating that information to other bees. Specifically, different patterns of dances can be used to represent different meanings such as distance. Whereas the homing pigeons are known for their ability to return to their home from distant locations. The left hippocampus play a pivotal role in the map formation. When the left hippocampus is lesioned, pigeons' ability to return to their homes is impaired. So, however, the lesioning just any part of hippocampus already impairs homing performance of the pigeons. Now, the left hippocampus is also crucial for the perception of landmarks within the environment. Other research suggests that the right hippocampus is involved in sensitivity to global features of the environment, for example, the geometry of the space. Now, humans seems to use three types of knowledge when forming and using cognitive maps. The landmark knowledge, which is the information about particular features at a location and which may be based on both imaginal and propositional representations. Those can be propositionally or imaginally. Second, the route road knowledge involves specific pathways for moving from one location to another. It may be based on both procedural knowledge and declarative knowledge. We generally use route road knowledge, not survey. So survey knowledge is where it involves estimated distance between landmarks, much as they might appear on survey maps. It may be represented imaginally or propositionally. So, example, in numerically specified distances, yung ilang kilometro yung layo sa atin na distance, ganun siya. Thus, people use both an analogical code and a propositional code for imaginal representations such as images of maps, landmark or the special buildings, road, procedures to get to one place from another. The survey is for global map like view. Gets? Yun yung shortcut niya. Okay? Yun yung shortcut. Landmark, special buildings, mga route road. It is procedures to get to one place from another. And yung survey is more on the global map like view. The next topic is the rules of thumb for using our mental maps, heuristics. When we use a landmark, a route road, and survey knowledge, we sometimes use rules of thumb that influence our estimations of distance. These rules of thumb are cognitive strategies termed heuristics. Now, heuristic is a mental shortcut that allows people to solve problems and make judgments quickly and efficiently. These rule of thumb strategies shorten decision-making time and allow people to function without constantly stopping to think about their next course of action. The heuristic is a mental statistic. It is very useful. It is not time-consuming. It is efficient. It is practical, but sometimes it is not accurate. Now, here are some examples. For the right angle bias, people tend to think of intersections, for example, street crossings, as forming 90 degrees angle more often than the intersections really do. For symmetry heuristic, people tend to think of shapes, for example, states or examples as being more symmetrical than they really are. Now, the next is rotation heuristic. That is when representing figures and boundaries that are slightly slanted like oblique, people tend to distort images as being more vertical or more horizontal than they really are. Next, alignment heuristics. People tend to represent landmarks and boundaries that are slightly out of alignment, but distorting their mental images to be better aligned than they really are, such as we distort the way we line up a series of figures or objects. Now lastly, for relative position heuristic, the relative positions of particular landmarks and boundaries is distorted in mental images in ways that more accurately reflect people's conceptual knowledge about the context in which the landmarks and boundaries are located rather than reflecting the actual spatial configurations. Now, our cognitive maps may be based not in reality, but rather in our exposure to the topic and to our constructions and heuristics. Creating maps from what you hear, or the text maps. The construction of cognitive maps based on procedural knowledge or following particular route as a rat in a maze. Propositional information, example is using mental heuristics, and observation of graphic maps. In addition, we may be able to create cognitive maps from a verbal description. Tversky noted that her research um, involved having the readers envision themselves in an imaginal settings as participants, not as observers in the scene. Tversky wondered whether the people might create and manipulate images differently when envisioning themselves in different settings. Now the question, which representation of information is correct? In fact, they might be complementary. For example, models postulating mental imagery and those positioning propositions can be seen as opposed to each other. However, this opposition is not necessary. Rather, it is in our construction of relation. People possibly could use both representations. Propositional theories might like to believe that all representations are fundamentally propositional, quite possibly through both images and propositions are way stations toward some more basic and more primitive form of representation in the mind of which we do not have any knowledge. A good case can be made in favor of both propositional and imaginal representations of knowledge. Neither is necessarily more basic than the other. The question we presently need to address is when we use which. So that would be all. That is my report. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Bye.